Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Lighthouse. I'm particularly honoured for having me back. It's always a real pleasure. It's a really great relationship I have with the guys here, and it's a joy. Yeah, drones. It's drones at the moment. They have a particular kind of, they're having a moment, and there's very good, serious political reasons for that. And I'm going to talk this evening mostly about my work and kind of research into drones specifically. But for me, it's also very much part of a wider investigation into not just technology itself, but the way technologies are kind of perceived, the way we come to understand them, which I'm sort of increasingly thinking is more effective, does more work in the world than the technology itself. This kind of the distance between us and our understanding of the technologies is the thing that almost has as much effect as anything else, if not more. But let's start with drones, and particularly with pictures of drones. My methodology, such as it is largely just go out and gawp at things, and then after a while start to kind of process them and try and work out, like, why does this thing have this draw to it? What is the attraction of this? So I knew I was interested in the drone stuff for a while. I was a little suspicious of myself. Is this just me being a kind of 12-year-old boy who likes planes? And that's a really valid kind of criticism that requires quite a strong answer. I have to be quite careful around that. They're objects which are very easily fetishized, essentially. They are strangely attractive images. And so it's necessary, I think, to think quite sort of clearly and thoroughly about them, which is kind of why this particular one is quite important. And this is quite a recent realization, this thing. But this is a particular image of a drone. This is key. This is an image of a Reaper drone, which is the one that's painted down the seafront. It's in the livery of the US Air Guard, in fact, a chapter of the New York Air Guard, who one of the crews that run Reaper drones. And it's an image I'd seen all the time. It's kind of, and there's a reason it's an incredibly popular image that's reproduced endlessly. It's because it's the first Google image result if you search for drone. And just that simple thing, and the fact that it's one of the only images I've ever seen where you can actually see the drone firing a weapon, has meant it's become incredibly popular. It's reproduced endlessly across the web. Each one of these is Google image results linking to more and more of these stories. Here it is, for example, on the homepage of a UK-based charity that's campaigning against automated weaponry, a really fantastic campaigning group doing amazing work, and so they chose that image as one of the cool ones on their homepage. Here it is again on the front page of The Nation, one of Pakistan's leading English language newspapers, but you see it reproduced endlessly. And I'd be kind of fascinated by this image for a while, and again I was sort of trying to work out why and how and what was it about it. It's the model for all kinds of things, and it's a powerful image of how we understand what these things are, and I think it's important that one's shown actually firing a weapon. Except this isn't real. I spent enough time looking at it that I finally kind of really got to understand it and paid enough attention to realize that it was a mock-up, that it's a photoshopped image. And it took a substantial more digging to kind of work that out, but if now I say it, it's kind of obvious. There's not enough detail there. It's too clean, it's too smooth, there's not enough kind of greebling on it, not enough kind of nuts and bolts. There's serious factual errors as well. The tail number doesn't match up. That 85 on there should be the date of manufacture, which is far too early. The NY is just all wrong. But it took a while, and did eventually track it down. It turns out that this image originates on the forums of 3D modeling hobbyists. A guy first posted this in 2009. I think, yeah, 2009. He posted his 3D model that he'd worked on, and then he posted some some renders of that, and then he photoshopped in some mountains from Afghanistan behind it. And this entirely constructed image has become the canonical version of this weapon. And hidden in that is kind of everything about drones. The fact that we don't fully understand them, in large part because we never see them properly. They're never seen by either the people that they kind of affect directly, those who are fired upon. They do see them sometimes, but not most of the time. And they're very rarely seen by us who send them there, who are all complicit in this. And so the fact that the most widely disseminated image of the drone is itself a kind of dream, kind of cascades down through our entire understanding of what these things are, because our understanding of what these things are is kind of incredibly fuzzy. I'll come back to that in a bit, but I collect, as I say, these kind of images of different things. Here's another example. This is an image that's widely distributed in the media as showing a drone strike. You may have seen it on websites or in newspapers. In fact, it's a civilian drone. It belongs to NASA, and this is it being tested as a firefighting tool. So that fire is deliberately set, and it's seeing if the drone can play a role in either observing or helping with firefighting. Peaceful application of this that in this case is interpreted as a military operation. And it's really not hard to see why the drones kind of end up being almost expressed this way, because there is, as I said before, something kind of strangely seductive and strangely otherworldly about them, even when you do see them. And to the best of my knowledge, this is a real photo of a global hawk at a European air show. There's still something deeply strange, deeply digital about them. It looks 3D modeled, it looks rendered, it looks like it's been kind of inserted into the world, which of course it very much is. Here's one inside a testing facility, an anechoic chamber in California, testing electromagnetic radiation. And you start to pull out these different aspects of trying to understand these things, trying to understand human relationships to them, for example. Because the people who fly them, they're very real planes, they're very real weapons, they have a relationship to them. We mark the names of pilots on the side of them, even though those pilots are tens of thousands of miles away, and in military tradition they're marked with their kills. Although even kind of anthropomorphized in some way, this is a French drone in Afghanistan, we still feel the need somehow to kind of attribute something that we recognize to these very strange objects. This repeats in kind of various kinds of imagery around them. This is an image that I made a few years ago. I was kind of playing with this. I've always been very interested in Google Maps and Google Earth and those representations of the world, how we've very quickly become comfortable with seeing the world through this kind of God's eye view, even though it is possibly one of the more extraordinary kind of developments in human sight in history. We think nothing of kind of pulling out our phones and seeing through the eyes of satellites. So I mocked this up in Photoshop and layered over this shadow as though the image had been taken by a drone rather than satellite, and this image has since happily spread itself around the web as the real thing, as such things do. But of course, it was only a few months later that I found this, which is an actual drone shadow, potentially, possibly. This is an image from Google Maps, actually, of Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, which is the main US testing and flight base. So they test the new drones there. It's also where drones in other countries are operated from in Nevada. That just at the moment that this particular predator was, if I remember rightly, by the area of the landing strip coming into land, the satellite was passing overhead just at the moment to connect it, to collect it. I started finding more and more of these on Google Earth. There's a strange thing when we're using one set of tools owned by corporations that they've released free to civilians to capture images of secret military devices. This is Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico in 2011. The slight shadows you can see there under the clouds are Global Hawks at Beale Air Force Base in California. These are predators lined up at General Atomics Grey Butte Field. That's General Atomics, the company that manufactures these for the military. Here they are at war. This is Kandahar in Afghanistan. So this is sometime in 2012. This is a photo of an active theatre of war. Iraq, back in 2004 at Joint Base Balad, these strange kind of cruciform objects you can see. This is a particularly strange one because this led to a lot of fights. This is a photo of the airbase at Shamsi in Pakistan in 2004. Which, if you know anything about the history of the US and Pakistani relationship, this was the point in which the US were conducting a secret, undeclared war in the tribal regions of Pakistan, which they're still doing. But at this time, this was not admitted or public. And at the time, the Pakistani government would claim responsibility for any attacks that the drones undertook. So at this time, it was no one knew, and it didn't emerge until it was revealed by someone finding these images in Google Earth that this war had been going on, or whether it was proven by this, it had been suspected for some time. But these images serve these different purposes. This is a predator that I made. One of the other aspects of kind of trying to understand these things, as well as kind of looking into the images and their deep, strange histories, is a kind of close encounters of the third kind type obsession of building these things, of trying to put them together in ways that make sense to me. And also in the kind of tradition of kind of model making, of working with your hands in order to get a material feeling for the thing. So this is a commercially available Airfix type model of a predator drone. And I built it because I wanted to understand the things better. I wanted to have a sense of them. This is some time ago, a couple of years, when I had no sense of what these things were. And we built it, and we were kind of sitting there going, no, this is nice, this is interesting, I kind of have a thing, but it's just this little thing. We had no sense of the scale of the object, and scale is quite important. We wanted to know what it would be like to stand in front of one of them, ultimately, to actually see it kind of face to face. Because without seeing the things, we have no true way of understanding them. I think that's really key. Particularly objects like this that are kind of constantly deliberately hidden from view. So we did the obvious thing, which was to actually sketch it out. This was in the car park in London, a little over January of last year. We just got a very basic schematic off the internet and sketched out this one-to-one representation of the object. And as it surprised us because we weren't really expecting it to be that big, quite simply. That's quite key. And that is brilliantly down on the seafront last week, which I stupidly didn't put any of the contemporary images in. But this is the same one from Istanbul of last year. But down on the seafront, watching people's first reactions to it here, the first reaction is always, oh, I had no idea it was so big. Which is sort of insane that people have so little sense of the physicality of these objects, which should kind of throw up a flag, essentially, to say when we have no idea, we can't distinguish between a Photoshop of the object and the real object. We have no idea of the scale of these things. It points to far deeper and far graver misunderstandings or miscomprehensions of what these things are. The model-making obsession will kind of continue. This is another project from I was in residency at the School of Visual Arts in New York last year. They gave me access to 3D printers. So obviously the first thing I did was start printing drones at scale. Again, trying to get this kind of sense of them, trying to work out how they felt in kind of landscapes, what their relationship to people was, essentially. I was unsatisfied with this as kind of a raw process. I think 3D printing is an odd way of kind of approaching these things, but it started to kind of look at these different representations, and particularly in kind of model making. This was one of the first images, actually, as well as my kind of 12-year-old boyishness that got me interested in this as a subject. This is an anti-drone protest in Pakistan from about 2007, I think. But this is also a photograph, and I think this is really significant, of technology being burned in effigy, which is not something that we've seen for some time. It has a fairly rich history going back to kind of breaking of the mills and so forth. But it implies a very visceral response to what is essentially a piece of technology. And it starts to make you understand what happens when these technologies are applied, essentially, the results of them, what they permit and the reactions to them. This is an image that I found today, and I have very little to say about it. This is from a protest in last month in April in Yemen now. This is where this kind of covert war that drones permit, an ongoing war of assassination, has largely spread now to the Arabian Peninsula from Pakistan, where it was kind of pioneered. This is a drone in the colours of the United States. There's a kind of mingling of the concepts here. The drone itself has almost become synonymous, well, with America and with a certain way of prosecuting war. This has been happening for some time. This is a protest in Hyderabad back in Pakistan, when the drones have become conflated also with the case of Afia Siddiqui, the so-called Grey Lady of Bagram, who's a Pakistani chemist currently in jail in the US under circumstances which the Pakistani government dispute. They've also been used widely in protest in the US and elsewhere, building these effigies of their technology as, again, a kind of constant process of trying to understand them. So I made this, which is a pretty much direct response to this invisibility, this lack of understanding around them. I was forced to go on a cadet camp as a teenager, spend a week on an army base in the Midlands, which was not fun. But one of the things I saw that had stayed with me forever was the image of a group of Gurkhas doing a tank recognition course. There were about 30 of them lying down in the grass, and about 20 feet away, their officer had like a big case out of which he was taking these tiny little lead models of tanks. And the Gurkhas were lying in the grass looking at these things through binoculars. It's kind of weird Father Ted, kind of these ones are far away moment. But there's something about that really intense gaze, that kind of looking at the thing in order to kind of fix it in the mind. And that's what I was kind of attempting to reproduce here with a set of different types of these drone technologies, a spotter's kit for recognizing these things. Because there's a history of this within the military as well. These are students in Pearl Harbor constructing recognition models. There's a huge schools program in the Second World War for the students to build these models that would then be used to train artillerymen, to train anti-aircraft people, and to train kind of fighter pilots and a whole bunch of other ones as well. Here they are in kind of classroom instruction, looking up at these planes, looking up at these little models in order to kind of comprehend them. These ID models that you could kind of absorb something of an understanding and differentiate between them, which is important. And this has a contemporary and deeply strange resonance in an event that occurred last year when Iran captured one of these, which is an RQ-170 Sentinel, which is the US's most advanced drone that we know about. A stealth aircraft, a spy plane essentially, which they've been using wherever they've been using, but have been using over Iran, sending them in from Afghanistan. And it's very unclear at this point how the Iranians got their hands on it. There's a lot of kind of competing claims, all of which are interesting, kind of jamming GPS systems and a whole bunch of strange things happening with kind of the electromagnetic spectrum, but they've definitely got it. And the US would really like it back, please. And they're not going to give it back. But instead, a number of enterprising businessmen in Iran started selling these, which you could buy around Tehran, suggesting that perhaps people would send them to Obama instead, in a particularly rude way. But this is my kind of favorite aspect of it, which is these guys. This is the Royal Observer Corps. This is kind of who the models are intended for a kind of a modern observer corps. So the Royal Observer Corps was formed in the 1920s, but really kind of grew up during the Second World War as kind of watching the skies, and continued all the way through the Cold War as well. And there's kind of equivalents in the US and other countries as well. But this is a civilian force, a volunteer civilian force, whose job was to watch the skies and pay attention, to think very deeply about what is going on, above them and around. and kind of in the hope of stimulating a kind of a contemporary volunteer, civilian watchers of the skies, people who are paying attention to this stuff in order to kind of understand it better. When you start to get really deep into what's happening around these machines, you realize what they permit in the world, how they actually how they go to work. And one of the key aspects of this is I mentioned before, these covert wars that are occurring outside the declared battlefields. So since about 2004, there's been an escalating assassination program, which tracks and kills suspected terrorists and militants in other parts of the world, in Pakistan, in the Yemen, in Somalia, and potentially other places that are less clear. And the ethics of that warfare, almost aside, what is striking about it is the degree of secrecy in which it's carried out, and the small amount about which we know about it. And that's not just in the kind of specific details, it's even where these things are carried out. And this was what started really bothering me about when I started looking through records of these strikes. So this is a brilliant organisation called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, who are a UK-based organisation who, amongst other projects, have been tracking reports of these drone strikes, which are not reported by the military, and trying to keep records of them. And they produce these reports that are drawn from all kinds of sources, recorded from media sources, but also eyewitness reports on the ground, collating what information they can about them. And they're often very unclear. It's always unclear of the exact location. It's unclear how many people were killed, or necessarily the time, or there's conflicting reports because there's no official reporting, there's no reporters on the ground. So it happens in this kind of zone of invisibility. And it happens in places that I don't know very much about. And I realized, like the drones, I don't even know what these places look like, which is pretty weird when you think about the last kind of 100+ years of kind of mass media mediated warfare. We used to send, in the Crimean War, papers would send sketch artists out to these places to draw the battlefields. You'd have these maps, you'd have this actually quite detailed information about troop movements and so on and so forth. And the whole process of, throughout 20th century war, we increasingly had reporters close to front lines, if not actually embedded with the troops themselves. And that brought war kind of very viscerally home. What these technologies permit is a complete obfuscation of the battlefield. I mean, not only that, an extension of the battlefield to the entire surface of the planet, for starters, but then completely managing to hide that battlefield at the same time. And yet, at the same time, we're building technologies that are supposed to allow us to see it exactly, right? There's this incredible contradiction here that we have these amazing technologies that allow us to zoom into the surface of the planet, but never to see what's actually going on there. This kind of illusion of connection and closeness that is also an incredible kind of distancing as well. So I started looking into trying to find as best as I could kind of locations for where these strikes were occurring, looking through the Bureau's reports in order to find places like this. This was a very rare occurrence. This was when a local actually posted Google driving directions to the site of a drone strike. It's about 50 kilometers south of Sana'a in Yemen. Most of them happen in places, particularly in the kind of tribal areas of Pakistan, of which there are very few good maps for some fairly good reasons. Though strangely, I mean, the place we bomb more than anywhere else is Miran Shah in Waziristan, a place where the RAF had a base 100 years ago doing aerial policing operations, but that's another strangeness. But most of the time, they're very vague, these areas you can find. It's quite difficult to find kind of exact locations, but I think just an attempt to make these battlefields visible is important. And so this is a project called Dronestagram, in which for every one of these reported strikes, I go and find a location as close as possible. And sometimes this takes, looking through kind of old maps, going through kind of regional newspapers, bits of Google Translate. It's a very dodgy science and it's very inaccurate. But I take these images of places nearby or close to the actual events and I post them to Instagram. which is a technology that's supposed to give you a daily glimpse of other people's reality, essentially. Gives you these little moments that happen in real time and syndicates them kind of out across the web through these social services that I said, like Google Maps, are services that are supposed to be bringing us all together, that are shortening the distances in time and space between us, which is what the network does. And it's what the drones do as well, right? They shorten time and space very effectively. But instead of using those same network technologies to make things clearer or to bring empathy, they use it to obfuscate and hide. The drones are prostheses, extensions of the network itself. Though it's one of its most natural outcomes, one of the most kind of expected things it could do. This leads to kind of strange offshoots as well as the usual expected kind of violent arguments in the comments that are always good to stay out of. But at the same time, I see a few places where there are actual conversations going on, however vitriolic, between people who are actually in Pakistan and people who are actually in America. And it does go some way in a very, very naive way, exposing some of the kind of biases of these media. Like exploring what are your expectations of the information you should get through those networks and the ways in which you're expected to respond to them. The fairly cliched of like, I don't want to like this, but it's the only option I have. The kind of, this project continues to be reasonably successful in the kind of coverage it got, which is gratifying and lovely, but also slightly terrifying in the way in which it was covered. Because if you start to look through these reports on what I'd done, which is a fairly simple procedure of reading a news report, looking it up on Google Maps, taking an image and posting it to Instagram, the way in which that are reported is all over the place. Of a fundamental misunderstandings of what these technologies are and how they operate. People thinking that Google Earth is some kind of like constant real-time CCTV view, that Instagram is a service or a platform or application, or these words are misused and mangled in ways that sort of make people who understand technology kind of laugh a bit. But when you understand that this is the media that is supposed to be delivering us really important information about the world that is saturated with technologies, they reveal just this complete lack of wider understanding of how these technologies operate that's absolutely critical to a critique of them. And unless we are better at kind of explaining how these technologies operate, that's why the drones happen, essentially, because they're so obscured by this. Let's go back to another of those images that I collect. Here's a photo that I call Drone Coming. This is, I'll read you the caption. This is Edwards Air Force Base, California. After supporting the global war on terror for 3 years, Global Hawk Unmanned Aerial Vehicle number 3 received its official homecoming today when its wheels touched down at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time at Edwards Air Force Base. This is a photo of a robot receiving a homecoming parade, which I don't know how to process. This is apparently a thing that's done. I don't know anything more about this than that. But what we're approaching here is something that I'm really increasingly fascinated about, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about tonight because I haven't thought about it enough and there's not enough time. But this is the automation that is coming. This is the other huge part of the kind of the extension of these technologies and extension of the network. The amount of previously human labor and time, and in some cases enjoyment or the opposite thereof, that is being replaced by machines, by robotic, and robots are always a difficult word to use here, but automated processes and machines. That we know this is coming, and there's some people out there waving their hands in a kind of slightly terrified way, going, "Oh my God, it's the end of the world, and the robot's going to take over." And the robots are going to take over. And that's okay as long as we start to think quite seriously about what happens socially and politically and legally around that, which we haven't done yet because these technologies, again, are obscure. And looking at military technologies is where you see this happening first. And you see it happening in these really weird, strange types of arguments. So this is a mock-up, an illustration of something called the Distinguished Warfare Medal, which was a medal proposed by the Department of Defense at the end of last year. the US proposed this as a medal for drone pilots who had distinguished themselves in warfare, which is a notion that immediately kind of confuses us, because the drones are operating over there on the battlefields, and the pilots who might get medals for this are sat safely in a big trailer somewhere in the Nevada desert. I'm not sure that, I have a huge problem with that specifically. Service medals are an accepted thing, and you get them for serving. What bothered a lot of people even more was this was going to go into the kind of medals table, and there's a hierarchy of these things, above the Purple Heart. And the Purple Heart is the medal that you get automatically if you are wounded on a battlefield. You are physically, being injured to your body by being there. And this is when people got really, really upset, that people who had worked remotely, in this way, who had not physically put themselves into harm's way, that would be rewarded higher by people who had. And that's, there's obvious kind of doubts, except there's deep strangenesses to that as well. There's growing evidence that new kind of psychological and physical reports coming out of the medical corps that drone pilots experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, to as high, if not higher levels than combat pilots. That their work is so intense and stressful that it is physically and psychologically damaging. And this is difficult to reconcile with so much of our understanding of technology, of so much of our preconceptions about what interacting through a screen results in. For so long we've had this sense that the technological, the digital, the virtual is this other space that is not the same as real life. And this is, many of us can happily rebuff that from experience, that we know how significant experiences that occur in digital spaces, or that occur, frankly, in the real world, mediated through technologies, because the two things are so tightly interleaved now, are just as real and just as valuable. But it's in slightly horrific circumstances like this that you see the kind of the true measure of these things as they occur. Because we live in this world, though, where all of our technologies are obscure but incredibly effective. This is a building in East London called Telehouse. I literally discovered it by walking past it and going, I wonder what that is, and doing the research, because it looked kind of crazy and it looked kind of digital. And I ended up interviewing the architect and discovering that it's very deliberately digital, because it is an incredibly significant digital building. It's part of a complex of buildings that form the third largest single kind of interconnection hub point of the internet in the world, and certainly the largest in the UK. Pretty much all stuff you do on the internet in the UK passes through this building or a couple of the ones around it, just out by Docklands and Canary Wharf. It's one of those kind of real catch points. But of course you wouldn't know that because the internet doesn't reveal itself in that way. We don't yet know what these things look like. I'm kind of particularly fascinated by the architecture of buildings like this, which is sort of gradually becoming more interesting as we realize that we have to work out what the internet looks like. Because as well as being a kind of new industrial architecture, this is a new civic architecture as well. All those things that you used to do in civic buildings, the big ones with the columns and the porticos like the banks and the libraries, places that you go to vote, things like that, they all happen in here now, right? And we need to kind of start to pull out those things, pull them out of the buildings and start to make them visible in order to make them accountable and understandable. This superstructure repeats at all the levels. That little box you have in your pocket is basically the same thing. It's a black box. It's a kind of unknowable access point to an unknowable network. We kind of got comfortable with them as these weird little kind of familiars, but most people don't really understand how they work. Julian Oliver, who's a kind of critical engineer, critical technologist, describes this as a kind of children's book version of reality, which is kind of view of it I love. That if you ask most people how the postal service works, how a letter gets delivered, you'll get a fairly coherent answer back. You write the name on the thing and you put it in a box and someone comes and collects it and they take it somewhere else and give it to them. Brilliant. ask most people how email works, and this whole facade kind of falls apart. We live in a world that really isn't magic, but appears as magic to kind of far too many people, that renders it kind of unparsable and illegible. But that technology, and it's important to remember, is visible to those who have the privilege to see it. That there is a power relationship kind of embedded in here. This isn't terribly clear, but what this is another image that I made, another Photoshop, but it represents a real thing. I'll read you, because this was inspired by a film that was shown here or hereabouts in Brighton recently. A film by Omar Fast called 5,000 Feet is the Best, and in which he interviews a drone pilot, or an actor playing a drone pilot based on scripts. At one point during this, the drone pilot gives this incredible description of seeing an IED or a group of insurgents setting up an IED, and they call in a strike. And he says, we call it in, and we're given all the clearances that are necessary, all the approvals and everything else, and then we do something called the light of God. The Marines like to call it the light of God. It's a laser targeting marker. We just send out a beam of laser, and when the troops put on their night vision goggles, they'll just see this light that looks like it's coming from heaven, right on the spot, coming out of nowhere from the sky. It's quite beautiful. That the drone then kind of extends this beam of light down to the earth that is only visible to those on its side who are wearing very expensive light vision goggles. Everything about this is about kind of privileged points of view, about the ability to see. And this next example may appear slightly frivolous, but I mean it entirely seriously. It took me, again, ages after making this and thinking about it for some time to understand where I'd seen it before. And it was here. I was among the hundreds, if not thousands, who turned out on the banks of the Thames to witness the grand opening of the Shard, Europe's tallest and horriblest building. And because we've been promised this kind of fantastic light show. And what happened in the event was pretty much nothing. There were some kind of little finger-wiggling kind of beams that came out of this thing, but the whole thing was a vast disappointment. And you can ask anyone who was there on the night that it was deeply underwhelming. But yet the next day, the newspapers were filled with these images of this spectacular light show that had occurred. Because, of course, all the photographers were taking long exposure photos of the show. They were seeing something through this technological mediation that no human eye on the ground could see. This was a spectacle designed, to be captured and reshown through the media itself. A way of kind of stepping aside from normal human concerns and moving up a level, power speaking to power, which is what they achieved very specifically. And what's happening here is a shifting and an elision of certain ways of thinking about something, but using technology very specifically to do this. I'm currently involved in a rather undignified spat with the Metropolitan Police Service. Is that the one? Yeah. So I had some quite, because I wanted to know how they're using drones. And it turns out it's not really about them using drones. It's what, again, drones permit them to do, what this veneer of technology permits. So last summer they made a whole bunch of noise about how they were going to use drones to police the Olympics. And they talked about this a lot, in all the press the police did around it, and then very little was heard about it again, and they've since refused to comment. So I thought I'd use the Freedom of Information request legislation to do what it's supposed to do, and I'll just ask them these questions straight up. So I say, were they employed during the Olympic Games? Under what circumstances? Under whose control was the command structures? What models of UAV do you have, by the way? And do you have clearance to be using them? And if not, are you planning to? These seem like reasonable questions to ask a publicly funded body. The Metropolitan Police is still stalling me on this question. They initially refused to answer point blank on the basis that it represented, that it came under the exclusion that the police and armed services have if it relates to operational requirements. By saying basically, we can't tell you anything about this because then people will know what we're doing with them and we won't be able to fight crime. Which is kind of hilarious and brilliant, except like, no. So I've started the appeal process, which they've already missed one deadline of. They've said sorry for that. They've promised to tell me by the end of May. But what I think is really interesting here is how the drones, I don't care if the police have got drones. I know they have to tell me though, because they've told me they've got cars, or they've told other people in FOIs, the license plate number of every single car they possess, the models of every helicopter they possess. So they don't have, there's no operational thing about simply releasing this information. Also, the CAA has released information about who has permission to fly them, on which the MPS does not figure. So they don't have permission to fly them. And yet, they're prepared to use the drones as an excuse, as a way of taking taking a huge amount of information and kind of moving it into this shadow sphere because it has this veneer of technology that will not be questioned. Because we don't know the questions to ask, and because we don't know enough about the technologies in order to even frame the questions that may be asked. And this use of UAVs as a kind of a screen for this kind of secrecy, or to up the levels of secrecy, is something that kind of must be challenged, not just in UAVs, but in all of these uses of technologies. It's essentially this challenge because this ends like this, with terrifying documents like this. This is the document with which Theresa May in 2010 signed away the British nationality of Mohammed Sakr. Mohammed Sakr was born and brought up in London. He held dual British and Egyptian citizenship, but he never had an Egyptian passport. At some point in 2009 or early 2010, he went to the Sudan, and while he was out of the country, the Home Office stripped him of his citizenship, which meant he couldn't return, and in fact, owning no other passport, he was pretty screwed wherever he was. 2 years later, he was killed in a US-targeted drone strike. This document gave the US permission to do whatever they wanted to do to Mohammed Sakr without any form of kind of judicial oversight. We don't know what he was charged with. Questions that would be asked to a British citizen were given away by this piece of paper. As the MPS, as the Shard uses light-sensitive lights to kind of make light visible in certain ways, as the Metropolitan Police Services use UAVs to kind of shift an argument from one domain into another. So pieces of paper like this are used to shift human beings from one category into another in ways that they could be acted upon violently by power. People can be kind of moved through dimensions in this way as well. Theresa May, just by the way, has stripped 16 British citizens of their citizenship since 2010. Then I'm going on a bit, aren't I? I'll hurry up. In October of last year, this was announced. This is a report in the Washington Post by the reporter Greg Miller, who revealed that the Obama administration had been developing something called the disposition matrix, which is totally unclear what it is. It's a black hole, it's a term. It replaces what was previously known colloquially as the kill lists, the names of people that the US administration wanted to target and kill with drone strikes. They didn't like the name kill list. So at some point they decided to kind of surface this term, disposition matrix, as I say, which remains entirely unclear what it is. It's kind of overseen by certain bodies, but it's clearly some kind of nexus of intelligence gathering, data mining, kind of investigation. Eventually, a name comes up and it goes to Obama and he says yay or nay, and that person gets killed or not. But it's a term that's kind of itself worthy of kind of inspecting and unpacking. It struck a particular chord for me because for some time I've been interested in the architectural theories of someone called Keller Easterling, who's an architectural critic, who's particularly interested in the kind of context of buildings and what they do. She uses the term disposition to refer to the propensity or temperament of forms which produce actions. So a canonical example could be a motorway. When you build a motorway, the full system is not described just purely in the kind of the movement of the cars, that's what it's facilitating. Its disposition kind of resides in the concrete itself, what this structure permits, how it integrates into the world. So if such forms can be said to have a disposition, do they have a kind of agency as well? Like just by what extent, by building these things, do we allow these things to happen? For Eastling, these architectures, these infrastructures, they actually kind of perform something. They shape the world around them, not just kind of physically, but legally, ethically, politically, diplomatically. Just as the drone kind of transforms not just the physical space around it, but its kind of legal and diplomatic spaces as well. The drones are kind of profoundly dispositional themselves. It's unclear what the US means in that terms of disposition. It seems like a deliberately shifty term. Do you mean like the dispositions of forces in a military context, or do you mean literally disposing of something? The disposition matrix is like these arguments we keep having itself. It's a performance. It's a way of talking about something while obscuring it at the same time, which has a fairly strong history in kind of propaganda and politics. One of my most recent project, which I'll mention briefly, is called A Quiet Disposition, named after this term, which is a project which attempts to kind of turn some of those tactics back onto the drone program itself. It's a software system that lives online, constantly scanning the web for news reports on the drone program, on drones, on the disposition matrix, and any of these kind of connected terms, and tries to, through kind of very naive artificial intelligence processes, to pull out some sense of what's going on here. It finds names and tries to draw the connections between them. It's an intelligence gathering system that's kind of turned back onto those propagating these things themselves. These linking terms, these pairs of names, generates these books of text. They're an attempt to point towards the kind of black box nature of these technologies. It is endlessly unclear what the processes are going on behind here. And it's also an attempt to kind of push this argument beyond the fetishization of the drone object itself, back into this murky world of legal and diplomatic, political infrastructures that the technologies are really just shells for. They're really just the way we manifest them in the world. Something else is going on kind of in the distance behind them. It also refers to some extent to the way in which these institutions have essentially lost the power of speech. They have become entirely untrustworthy, and we've known this for some time, that we can't trust them what they say because they won't talk about these things. So I see the drones as kind of as prosthetics, as avatars of the network, because they perform the same affect as the network itself, granting the ability to communicate, to see and take action at these vast distances. But while the civilian network is kind of tuned to openness, these military technologies and the drones use exactly the same technologies to obscure and divide. Though I've long been a vocal advocate of the new, I also believe that technology actually engenders very few truly novel actions or experiences, rather enables or permits latent ones, and thus reveals them to our new technologically augmented view, if and only if we truly understand them. Obscurity is a classic tool of power, but it's now kind of married to this other one, which is ignorant, and the two play on each other. Actions that are carried out in plain sight are hidden from view, and this aura of technology permits that. So here's the thing. It's not about drones at all. It's about these technologies. It's about the black boxes. The drones stand for all of our invisible, intangible, noumenal technologies, but kind of behind them, in these strange images, in these gaps, we can possibly see kind of what's actually going on. The true state of the world is revealed in the intersections of technology and culture as they emerge into the world as visual imagery, but also as the more complex psychological responses and mental models that underpin them. The world is formed as much by our understanding of technology, that's what I said at the beginning. It's formed as much by how we understand these technologies as the technologies themselves. And at the moment, we lack the the metaphors, the mental models to truly talk about these things and to truly understand them. But what I'm really hoping this kind of leads to, where I hope it's going, what I'm increasingly interested in, is that while technology obscures, it also kind of means things that have to be written down. They kind of have to be solidified and codified in the real world. So the drone program is awful and obscure and illegal and a huge bag of bad things, but it is there. Like it's a bunch of objects that leave records and networks, that leave traces, that is ultimately accessible to us. That obscurantist power of technology that hides these things is also ultimately, through our understanding, what will reveal them to us, if we can only learn how to look deeper and think more carefully about them. Thank you.
And whilst that's happening, well, firstly, thanks again for that fantastic talk, which I think gives some really important background to, kind of the piece that we're, seeing on the seafront. But also, I think, to the ideas which are inherent in both the project by, kind of Marila and yourself, and why, sort of taking a sort of almost political action to make something visible so that we can start having this conversation is important. I have a feeling there's probably questions from the floor. I've got some myself, but I wanted to open it out to you immediately for immediate responses. Shadkur?
Hi. As a parent, it's always a good start to a question. As a parent, I'll be much happier for my daughter to control play at a distance by some of that, which we've got in our plan to blow up. So even though I'm already conflicted about the programme, it's a piece of technology. It's no different from the troops in the First Gulf War firing Scud missiles a hell of a long way to the side of the battlefield and not actually engaging directly. Do you think there's something fundamentally different about a drone flying autonomously than there is from any other long-distance weapon?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Still puzzling that out. I think it raises... so that's the standard argument of proponents of drone warfare, which is an entirely valid one, is that they prevent our own troops getting killed, that we'd rather have some a robot crash out there than a human do so. And I buy that argument. I personally, whatever my personal political feelings about warfare in general, I totally understand that argument. I think it's valid. But new types of weapons also always permit new kinds of warfare. We spent the whole 20th century devising rules for warfare, which, as terrifying and occasionally laughable a concept as that is, have done a huge amount to kind of codify what we do to one another. The drones are tools for getting around those rules, essentially. And like most technologies, they sort of race ahead the legal frameworks that we kind of put around them. There's brilliant efforts going on now to kind of write new laws to kind of cover this stuff. But I see them as also, they're terrifying in another sense, which is that they are, to my mind, essentially anti-civilian weapons. Or they are weapons that are designed to operate in wars that were not possible to be fought by people. So, they're not just saving the lives of, servicemen on the ground in declared wars. They're permitting us to extend the boundaries of war to places where we wouldn't have gone before. There's no way we would fight a war, a ground war, in the tribal areas of Pakistan. The Pakistani army won't even fight a ground war there. But by doing, so no lives are being saved on our side by doing this. Possibly in the wider sense of fighting terrorism, I agree. Would disagree with me entirely. And that's a valid argument as well. But they do operate in fundamentally different ways and permit fundamentally different wars to previous ones that occurred, is my rambling answer.
So before I take this question, I just wanted to make a follow-up point and then bring Alex in. You briefly touched on this, and it might be related a bit to, kind of to Sharko's point. At the moment, kind of all military drones, whether they're operated from the UK or the US, they're operated by human beings, and there's a decision-making chain, kind of which is operated by human beings, which effectively kind of, sort of covers every aspect of their operation. But I guess the concern that those of us who are following technology quite closely have is, what if we're moving towards sort of increasing layers of automation? What if that decision-making, kind of that sort of moral layer, kind of starts being eroded by, kind of increasingly efficient algorithms, kind of, which is what you're exploring in the Quiet Disposition, kind of show in London. Kind of what if, sort of increasing automation with, the sort of increasing so-called accuracy of these flying robots come together?
Yeah, that's where we're heading towards for robotic warfare. And while there's organisations who are currently now trying to write those laws, that's in fact already happening. There are fully automated weapons already operating in the DMZ in Korea, for example, that require no human intervention before they use lethal force. That's an argument that we need to be having better. And it's an argument that I think again, this obscuration that's made possible through the use of certain types of technology prevents us from having a good discussion about.
So, so you would say almost, kind of the act of, an artist, a critical engineer, kind of like an activist at this point is to kind of lift the lid, kind of expose the, kind of the action, the activity, the, kind of the machinery in order to critique them before it's too late, before it's not, kind of a set of decisions made by people effectively controlling remote control planes. It's effectively a real disposition matrix.
Yeah, it's a societal discussion, not purely a military one.
Yeah.
But which in fact brings us entirely back to the types of 20th century kind of anti-war activism. It's exactly the same extension of the same thing. But those weapons were slightly easier to explain.
Alex, did you have a question?
It wasn't actually a question, it was just to follow up on your point about what the difference is potentially between the missile and the drone. You said Scud missiles, I think they're kind of like fire and forget, like you fire them the best guess and you let it go and it lands. Whereas the drone is like this continuous dialogue between the pilot and the drone. There's like this kind of sense of agency that it has, and there's reports I've read of after drone strikes have happened, they've not been able to get casualties out because drones are sort of circling around and they're kind of scared that there are going to be more strikes and more people are going to get killed. So I think there's a big difference because it's like it's a remote kind of remote thing with agency. Yeah, but it's got a continuous. If you fire a missile, you fire it, it goes and it's gone. Whereas with the drone, it's basically it's mine. Decision.
It's linked to a surveillance system.
It's my agency in a remote space, but it's a continuous. So I can go, oh look, some more people running, I can be hovering around. I think that's quite a big difference because also I don't have in that situation. I don't have the fear of being hurt myself, so it makes me almost like a god. And with this agency, unless my drone is destroyed, I can basically do what I want, and I think that's a very dangerous thing.
We've got other questions and comments.
I mean, in terms of public relationship with technology, and you kind of like you touched upon it, this kind of burning Fiji golden calf thing in terms of the drone. I mean, what does this tell for technology? For instance, I walked past an orography stop in Brighton, which has an anti-cyborg sign outside of it, where they're obviously preempting the existence of Google glasses in Britain, and so the idea of people are kind of preparing themselves for this rush of technology, where it is kind of putting itself further than we can control it. I mean, what does that have for people, not reversing technology as such, but more kind of becoming keenly aware of how much it impacts them on the daily life, but even if it is invisible, like what does the public kind of, can you this is a really big ask, but can you kind of forecast what the public relationship of technology will be now that drones are more visible, like the idea of the cyborg is more visible, all sorts of kind of.
I don't like forecasting, and I wouldn't. But I think Google Glass is a good example of one of these technologies. Actually, has sort of been around for some time. It's been put into backed by Google, it's been put into quite a seductive package, and that's doing a really fascinating job of kind of subtly pulling out all these kind of conversations that people really need to have about these technologies.
I think you pointed in the direction of an article saying not so much what the wearer, but the people who are around it, and how their experiences of it. Same to us as people and civilians experiencing drones.
Yeah, but there's a kind of collateral privacy damage that comes with wearing those things. But for me, it also hopefully leads to a wider discussion about kind of surveillance in general. One of my kind of keen interests in why the drones is that aspect of surveillance as well, this sense of being watched all the time. For me, glass is, I think it's more of a strange internalization of surveillance as much as anything else. That people are so comfortable with having cameras everywhere, they'll wear them, fixed to their heads, which is a deeply strange way of being. But we've become so acculturated to it because it's arrived through these venues of talk of security, talk of safety and fighting crime and all this kind of stuff, that we don't think of a whole bunch of the other implications of that until we're sat across from someone who's constantly pointing a camera at our face. There are ways of talking about those. They're technologies that become objects around which the conversation can happen.
Whoa, Russian questions. Oh my goodness. Okay, Phil first.
You touched on the public debate and lack thereof that's going on about all this. It's starting to happen in the UK. For example, Chris Coker at the NC, we talked about last week called Warrior Geeks, Technology in the 20th Century. Related to Rico, it touches exactly what we're talking about. How do you consider the public debate developing, or how can it be stimulated to develop into the wider sphere?
I don't know. It still also feels like it needs such kind of huge steps. It needs something like Google to release something like Glass to have that surveillance conversation. It needs the drones being, controlled from the UK to have the discussion here, even though that's been happening for several years from somewhere else. It's such a huge effort to move these things into public understanding. And when artists do it, it's very small pokes. My response to that is the same to all these kind of questions. Technology is better understanding of technology and a better literacy in technology. And that's going to come from, on one side, just generally better education, but also, from practitioners in this stuff, a more kind of willingness to talk openly about it, to think more about how we communicate this stuff, to lay the workings of these things open more, to move away from the kind of technologies that appear totally flat and seamless, and without overcomplicating them. It's really gnarly. But our first instinct as technologists is to make everything disappear and to obscure all the complex questions about it. And I know this just sounds like yelling at kind of engineers in the 1960s to not work on the nuclear bomb. Which is a valid thing. And there's calls now for the International Society of Robotic Engineers is calling on people not to work on drone programs. It's the same thing. I think it has to come out of a wider visibility of technology in society. And this kind of comes back to that Stop the Cyborgs thing, which is kind of annoying because it's just people going, no technology, I don't want to discuss this. It's like when your dad says he can't work the printer, which means could you use the printer kind of thing. It's pushing those issues to one side rather than actually trying to understand them at a deeper level.
We've got a couple of questions, I think. George, you want to be first?
Yes. I'm conscious that's probably most coherent of it. The objects of the network being really struck a chord, and I thought, of course, the place I've heard that before is in all the dialogue around the Internet of Things. And I'm curious about drones being at one end of the spectrum and adorable little kind of domestic devices being the other, domestic devices being very deliberately designed to be adorable, friendly, controllable, but drones at the other being kind of silent, no eyes, no face, no kind of fringy thing, just there. And it was more exciting than anything else. I wonder if there's anything there. Oh yeah,
no. I mean, the drones are entirely part of the Internet of Things. They absolutely are, and the public confusion between types of drone is symptomatic of that as well. That people hear about drones and a lot of the time they mean those kind of little quadricopter things that allow you to do brilliant aerial filming. And that's great, but it's turned them into something kind of that hobbyists do, and kind of that because we lack this explicit terminology to talk about them in different ways. You were obliquely, I think, referring there to the little printer a little bit, which is a device, for those who don't know mobile design industry, called Berg, which is a little internet-connected printer that sits in your house and does lovely things. One of the lovely terms that Berg use in their design process is moogification, which is the process by which you make a piece of technology so like delightful and charming that you actually invite it into your house, the way that Muji operates, basically. And I see Google Glass as kind of moogification of total surveillance. It's that kind of internalization of those processes. Drones are, is open to that kind of internalization. And frankly, worryingly, they are a bit as well at the moment. If you go and look at the stuff online, there's a shed load of drone art around at the moment. There's also just a lot of drones in popular culture, and there's like funny cartoons about drones, and there's, these are all ways of attempting to kind of understand these things. But most people's response to technology in general is either to go, and run away, or it's to kind of cutify, anthropomorphize, and that particularly when you start talking about robotics, you immediately get, boxes with smiley faces on the front. And that's, we need another category really badly. We're really struggling to talk about stuff that isn't dead, digital, remote, virtual, or live, human, warm, friendly, animalistic, anthropomorphized. And we still have not managed to generate the category for these technologies that do not fit either of those things.
Well, I guess it's sort of object-oriented ontologies sort of purpose in the world. I know we're running out of time, and I think we've got more than one question. There was one there. Did you still have it, or do you feel like it's been answered?
No, I just really wanted to say that when you talk about most people who want to run away from technology rather than think about it, there's a whole new load of people who are teenagers who've grown up with this literacy about technology, which is so needed, which when Instagram is talked about in ways that make no sense in the traditional media, they can see through it, and they are the people who look at a 3D image of a drone and recognise it as a drone.
I really would beg to differ on that. I don't believe there's some magic technological literacy in children. I don't.
My students were more technologically literate than children now.
I think there remains a kind of separate technological caste. They may be more comfortable using these things, but I've taught classes of 18, 19-year-olds who are studying critical theory, right? Who are supposed to be thinking most intensely and deeply about the world. And I've gone, what do you think about Facebook? And they just go, it's just somewhere I post photos. They don't...
But they are immersed in it. It's not like this thing...
Yeah, but that's like being underwater. It doesn't necessarily give you, you don't necessarily understand the medium you're within. Sorry to be quite harsh on this one, but the whole digital natives kind of idea of this stuff is no case. And in fact, they're more like they've been kind of inoculated or whatever, that there's more of a Stockholm syndrome thing going on there. There's plenty of young people who are good at critiquing this stuff, but there's no natural ability to do so.
Okay, but I think this feels like a much wider and larger conversation, which we can continue afterwards. I think we have one further question from over here. Was there one or two? Yep, one. Okay, and we're going to end on this note.
I was just quite curious about why you chose a certain video guide to post the drone. Was that thinking about kind of border, borders and frontiers? And also maybe I wondered if you were thinking about the history, sort of like during the Second World War, when this was like an invasion site, or regarded as an invasion site, like the beach was like heavily mined, covered in barbed wire, completely inaccessible.
Yeah, I'd like to say yes to all of those things. I would have to admit it was a little bit more practical than that. We were presented with a fairly restricted number placed by the council, in which the conditions for the siting of it are where we can get away with it, which knocks most places out. There's then some questions about kind of how people approach it and view it. So the real attraction of that site, apart from it being quite central and therefore there would be people around, is more about the kind of viewpoints that you have down upon it. That it's on the road, you can stand there, or you can stand on the thing above, or you can stand right up top, and there's different viewpoints to it. To me, kind of quite add to people's understanding of it. There's something you kind of see from different distances and different perspectives. I did try and do some kind of research particularly into Brighton. I think was bombed once in the war, but was also very much kind of built up and stuff. But it did set me off thinking about quite a lot about the research I did do as a result of its particular sighting in Brighton, was to look back more than I'd done previously into the history of kind of Second World War robotic weapons, and particularly into the V weapons, the terror weapons, the V1 and the V2, where it's really striking looking at newspapers from the sort of 1944 in particular, when they've sent over these waves of weapons, where you've got this incredible articulation of man versus robot. And all the newspapers were filled with stories of Hitler's robot weapons and the brave men of the RAF who were fighting this inhuman war fighting against these inhuman machines, fighting this incredibly important battle that was man versus machine. That they were perceived as robots then and as evil. And there's if you ask about the kind of artillery and kind of previous forms of warfare, then the V1 weapons in particular are about as closely as you can get the doodle bugs to like a drone weapon. They're kind of slow and fat and they're in there, but there's not a lot you can do about them. It turns out quite a lot we could do about them, and it was quite interesting what they did. But that as an articulation of a kind of a robotic weapon is the closest I got to kind of trying to find those particular kinds of links. I think it is a thing, the shadow, that takes on its own significance kind of wherever it's employed, and probably local people are always going to know a bit more about those histories than I'm going to.
Can I ask you just a stupid quick question? It's probably a health and safety / risk assessment, but why is it green?
Yeah, no, it's a valid question. Again, a little bit column A, a little bit column B. To place it where we want, or where I wanted to, the particular orientation, because I didn't want it kind of boxed in. I didn't want it to look like it had been put exactly where they told us to put it. I wanted to kind of poke it onto the road and all that kind of stuff, which means you're not allowed to use white and yellow, which are reserved colours for the highways, blah, 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 which I was kind of fine with because I wanted to see what it would look like in different contexts, and I'd wanted to use the green in particular. And the green is kind of really significant, though I sometimes have trouble articulating why. It's not as commenters on the Argus website have frequently alleged some kind of reference to your local MP, though that has been mentioned. It's in fact an entirely different kind of green. It's the opposite of that green. It's chroma key green. It's green screen green. It's the green of cinema backdrops and so chroma key green. That green screen is in one sense like the most unnatural colour because it's the furthest from kind of human skin tones and so forth, which is why they use it in cinema special effects. And so for me, it's kind of like it's the colour of technology itself. It's the colour of the future. It's the colour that we never see but machines see, onto which we kind of layer our fantasies of technology and the future and all those kind of things. Those are the resonances of that green for me.
Which feels like a really good note to end on, and also something that you may kind of find as a point of connection back to some of the work that Marila's showing at Regency Townhouse, as well as the work that she's showing upstairs, and that you would have started, I guess, kind of seeing in the light of God, kind of work that James showed earlier. So hopefully that kind of starts sort of unfolding some of the connections between the drawing, the work upstairs, the work that Marila's showing, kind of elsewhere in Brighton. So please join with me and thank James for his fantastic